Thank you very much, John, for the kind words. Thank you all for coming out tonight to listen to me speak. It's actually a pleasure to be here. There are three basic questions on the table about Ukraine. The first is, what caused the war? Number two is, what's the state of the war today? Where are we at the moment? And then the third question is, what is likely to happen moving forward? And I don't want to talk about the causes of the war. I may say a few words in the conclusion, but I'm not going to talk about the causes of the war. I want to focus mainly on where this train is headed. But to talk about where the train is headed, it's important to talk about where we are today first, and then segue in to talking about the future. And I'm going to make two arguments. The first argument is that there's no chance of a meaningful peace agreement. There may be at some point in a distant future a ceasefire, and that will then turn into a frozen conflict. But the chances of resolving this in any meaningful way are remarkably small, in my opinion. And then my second argument is that the Russians are going to win the war. They're not going to win a decisive victory, but they're going to end up conquering a huge chunk of Ukrainian territory beyond what they already have. And they're going to take Ukraine and make sure it remains a dysfunctional rump state. Let me make three preliminary points before I get to the substance of my talk. First of all, I'm predicting the future. And as we all know, we live in a remarkably uncertain world, and prediction is, a tricky business at best. So just be aware that I'm not speaking the truth. I'm telling you what I think is likely to happen. Second point is, I am in the business of explanation. I'm not trying to justify the behavior of Putin or tell you what I hope happens. I'm simply going to tell you, based on a lot of experience thinking about these issues, what I think is going to happen. And then finally, you want to understand that I really need 4 hours, but John wouldn't give it to me. So I'm going to be quite cursory on a number of issues, and that'll leave plenty of opportunities for you folks to ask me questions, and I'll answer questions for as long as you want and John permits. Okay, so again, what I'm going to do is first focus on where we are today, right? And then I'm going to segue into talking about where this train is headed. With regard to where we are today, there are three main actors in the story. The United States or the West is one, Ukraine is two, and then on the other side you have the Russians. And what we have to talk about is the threat environment that each one of those actors faces and the goals of each one of those actors as things stand today. In other words, we want to look at Russia, the West, and Ukraine. Focus on what the threat environment is, what their goals are. And then finally, we want to say some words about what the situation is on the battlefield today. And that's the basic outline I want to take you through in talking about the present situation. First of all, with regard to Russia's threat environment, there's no question that the Russians believe that they face an existential threat from the West and from Ukraine working together against them. An existential threat in the sense that they believe that their survival is at stake. And I can unpack later, if people would like, what is meant by the term survival. But there's no question that Putin himself uses the phrase existential threat to talk about what the Russians are facing. Now, there are two layers to that existential threat. The first layer is the pre-war layer, and that one is all about the West's efforts. And here the United States was really in the driver's seat, to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border. And that strategy or policy, of course, included NATO expansion, EU expansion, and turning Ukraine into a pro-Western liberal democracy. Those three policies packaged together were all designed, again, to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's borders. The Russians made it unequivocally clear from 2008 forward that this was unacceptable and that it was not going to happen, and they made it clear that they would destroy Ukraine as a functioning society before they would let it happen. That's the first layer of the existential threat. The second layer of the existential threat comes into play after the war starts. Once the war starts, the United States has to stipulate what its goals are vis-a-vis Russia. And we have made it clear that our goal is to defeat the Russian military in Ukraine, to wreck its economy, and to, in effect, knock it out of the ranks of the great powers. There's also all sorts of rhetoric coming from the West and people in the administration, right, that make the argument that we should go beyond that and that we should pursue regime change. Then we should put Putin on trial. And there's even lots of talk these days about breaking apart Russia the way the Soviet Union broke apart in December 1991. This is the second layer of the existential threat. So there's no question that the Russians see themselves facing an existential threat. And I might add here that I have a number of friends who argue that the Russians are not facing an existential threat. My response to them is very simple. It doesn't matter whether you think they're facing an existential threat. The only thing that matters is whether they think they're facing an existential threat. And there the evidence is remarkably clear, in my opinion. So that's the threat environment for the Russians. Then the question is, what are their goals? Now, a lot of people think that the Russians are bent and have been bent since February 24th, 2022, in conquering all of Ukraine and in absorbing it into a greater Russia. The Russians have never been interested in that, and they're not going to try to do that. What the Russians are interested in doing is capturing a substantial portion of Ukraine and also making Ukraine a dysfunctional rump state. They have already formally annexed 4 oblasts plus the Crimea, and they have made it clear they have no intention of giving that territory up. I might add here that they don't control all 4 of those oblasts completely at this point in time. But those 4 oblasts plus Crimea make up 23% of Ukraine's territory. I also believe that they will take the 4 oblasts that are immediately to the west of those 4 oblasts, and this includes Odessa and Kharkiv. And once they do that, they will control 46% of Ukrainian territory. Dmitry Trenin, who is a well-known and well-plugged-in Russian strategist, argues that they will take those 8 oblasts plus Crimea, as I described it, but they will also take additional territory in the north of Ukraine that runs basically up to the part of Kiev that is on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. Now, what will guide Russia's thinking in the conquest of this territory? First of all, there's the Donbass problem. The Russians have to make sure that they basically take and control all of the areas that have large numbers of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers. Because if they don't, they'll have the Donbass problem all over again. And you remember the Donbass problem from roughly 2014 to 2022 where you effectively had a civil war in that region between ethnic Ukrainians on one side and ethnic Russians and Russian speakers on the other. They don't want that to happen again. And the only way to prevent that from happening is to take all of the areas where you have large numbers of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers. And that's why I think for sure they'll take those other 4 oblasts to the west of the 4 they've already taken. That's the Donbass problem. Then there's the porcupine problem. The porcupine problem is they don't want to conquer territory that has lots of ethnic Ukrainians, because as you all know, the ethnic Ukrainians hate them and they will fight like wild dogs to resist the Russians, even if the Russian military wins on the battlefield. So they will stay away from the territories, in large part, that are west of the Dnieper River. Then they have to make sure that they take enough Ukrainian territory that they turn Ukraine into a genuine dysfunctional rump state. For example, it makes eminently good sense, so lots of Russians say, to take Odessa, because if they control Odessa in addition to all of what they now control, they basically control Ukraine's Black Sea coastline, and that will enable them to strangle the Ukrainian economy whenever they see fit. So my argument is they're going to take a lot more territory than they already have taken, if they can. And you want to understand that I have not said anything about the military dimension of this conflict. And it may be the case that they don't have the military capability to take all that territory. We'll discuss that later. But now my point is that in terms of the goals that the Russians have set for themselves, I believe, based on a series of articles and conversations with some Russians, that their interest is in taking a large chunk of Ukrainian territory and also turning Ukraine into a dysfunctional rump state and keeping it as a dysfunctional rump state. Now, what about the United States and the West? And when you talk about the West, the main focus is on the United States because the United States is the leader of the pack. But nevertheless, the Europeans do matter somewhat. I don't want to completely dismiss their influence. Let's talk first about the threat environment, as I did with the Russians, and then go to the goals. It's very interesting. Before 2014, this is when the crisis first broke out, you all remember, in February of 2014, February 22nd, 2014. Before that date, even though we were interested in expanding NATO eastward, there's no evidence in the public record that that was aimed at containing Russia. There's no evidence that we thought Russia was a serious threat before February 22nd, 2014. But of course, when the crisis broke out, we did a sudden turn, and all of a sudden, Russia became a really serious threat. And you all understand that the reason we did that was we did not want to blame ourselves for the outbreak of the crisis. We wanted to blame the Russians. So, of course, Russia had to be a threat. Putin had to be an imperialist bent on creating a greater Russia. But that happened all of a sudden. But nevertheless, we did not view Russia as an existential threat at the time. I think since the war has started, we have slowly but steadily worked ourselves in the West to the point where we now view Russia as an existential threat. I'm not completely sure that's correct, right? But that's my sense, that that's where we're at. In the Russian case, it's easy to make the case that they see what we're doing in the West with Ukraine as an existential threat. And I'll get to Ukraine in a second. It's easy to make the case that Ukraine sees what the Russians are doing as an existential threat, obviously, right? With regard to the West and with regard to the United States in particular, it's a trickier case, so be aware of that. And we can go over that issue in the Q&A if need be. But why do I say that? Well, first of all, if you look at the East Europeans, and here we're talking mainly about the Poles and the Baltic states, they clearly view Russia as an existential threat. But I would argue that virtually every country in Europe depends for its security on NATO. This is not talked about much in the West, but the fact is that deep down, European leaders completely understand that NATO provides security for them. It's their security umbrella. And the great fear here is that if we lose in Ukraine, it will do significant damage, maybe even destroy the alliance. And therefore, people are deeply committed to making sure that that doesn't happen. And I sense that is, in effect, an existential threat. Then there's the United States and China. The fact is that the United States sees China as a greater threat than Russia. And in the United States, there's a widespread feeling that if we lose in Russia, that this will have a devastating effect on our ability to contain China. So we have to win. I think, in my opinion, there's no question that American policymakers view China as an existential threat. It's a peer competitor that's threatened to dominate Asia. We do not tolerate that. Russia's not a peer competitor, but if Russia wins in Europe and the United States is delivered a blow, it will have significant consequences for our position in Asia. Finally, I think there is a widespread perception that the Russians are a threat to the liberal international order. And even more importantly, this is a fight between democracies and authoritarian states. And if the Russians win, it'll be a devastating blow to the democracies in their competition with these authoritarian states. So you have somebody like King Charles, who recently said in Germany, the security of Europe as well as our democratic values are at stake. The security of Europe as well as our democratic values are at stake. I think that view is widespread in Europe and even in the United States. And in fact, these are the words that were recently introduced in a congressional resolution that has not been passed yet. Quote, United States interests, European security, and the cause of international peace depend on Ukrainian victory. All of this to me hints that we view what the Russians are doing as an existential threat. Now, what are our basic goals? I've already explained what our basic goals are, right? We are bent on, again, knocking Russia out of the ranks of the great powers. We're even talking, again, about regime change in Russia, putting Putin on trial, and maybe breaking apart Russia the way the Soviet Union was broken apart in the early 1990s. So our goals are remarkably ambitious. And by the way, they're consistent with the claim that I made a minute ago that we view Russia as an existential threat. If you look at what we're doing, it fits neatly with the claim that Russia is an existential threat or something very close to that. Furthermore, it's very important to emphasize that we remain firmly committed to bringing Ukraine into NATO. And of course, this is an absolute no-no for the Russians. Let me say a few words about the Ukrainians now. Their threat environment. They view the Russians as an existential threat. This is really a no-brainer. Given what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, it's clear that Ukrainians think they are facing an existential threat. And with regard to Ukraine's goals are basically the same as our goals. The Ukrainians have a deep-seated interest in seeing Russia knocked out of the ranks of the great powers. To put it in General Austin's words, the Ukrainians have a deep-seated interest in making sure that Russia never again has the power to invade another country. So the Ukrainians are with us in terms of what basic goals are. So I think basically what you have here is a situation where both Russia and Ukraine clearly view the other side as an existential threat, and where I believe the West, including the United States, view Russia as an existential threat. Now, let me say a few words about the battlefield. It's very important to understand that this is a war of attrition. The basic goal of each side is to bleed the other side white. This is not a war of maneuver. There are no blitzkriegs here. This is Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali standing toe-to-toe and beating the hell out of each other. This is a battle like World War I, fights at Verdun, at the Somme, and so forth and so on. It's a classic war of attrition. I think in 2002, for most of that year, I think the Ukrainians had the upper hand. And as you remember, in the late summer of 2022 and also in the early fall of 2022, the Ukrainians scored victories in terms of capturing territory in Kharkiv and in Kherson. And as you know, the Ukrainians were, at the end of last year, at the end of 2022, thought by many to be in a position where they could actually win the war, because 2022 was a good year. I believe that after the Russians mobilized 300,000 troops and begin to rationalize their military, make the necessary adjustments, I think what happened is that the Russians got the upper hand in 2023. And I think the Russians now have the upper hand. I think the fact that that the Russians just took Bakhmut, this fight that lasted for many months, and where the Ukrainians fought fiercely to contest the Russians. The fact that the Russians won, I think, is evidence that the Russians have the upper hand. I think the fact that the Ukrainians do not want to launch their counteroffensive is evidence that they're in trouble. The only reason they're thinking about launching an offensive, and may indeed launch that offensive soon, is because of tremendous pressure from the West. They don't want to do it because they understand that they're in trouble. And in a minute, I'll explain to you why that's the case. But despite the fact that I think the Russians have the wind at their back in 2023, in contrast to 2022, I don't think one could argue at this point in time the Russians have won the war in any meaningful way. So I just want to be clear, that's not my argument. I'm just making the case that today, when you look at the battlefield, you look at the military balance between the two sides, I think the Russians are in better shape than the Ukrainians. And I think, again, the Ukrainians were in better shape for most of 2022. All right, so let's shift gears now and talk about where we're headed. And let me focus first on the battlefield. And when I focus on the battlefield, I'll pick up from where I just left off, talking about the present situation on the battlefield. I'll talk about the future situation, and this is where I'll make the case that the Russians are going to win this war. This is, as I said, a war of attrition. It bears more resemblance to World War I than it does to World War II. And who wins a war of attrition is a function of three factors: the balance of resolve, the population size of the adversaries, and the amount of artillery that each side has. It's very important to understand that artillery is the main weapon when you're fighting a war of attrition. when I was in the Army and then when I went to West Point, it was impressed upon us that artillery is the king of battle. And when you get into a fight like the Ukrainians and the Russians are now engaged in, the casualty exchange ratio is largely a function of the artillery on each side. So you want to ask yourself, as we think about this conflict, what does the balance of resolve look like? What do the population figures look like? And what does the balance of artillery look like? Because the balance of artillery tells you a great deal about casualty exchange ratios, which obviously matter greatly in a war like this. All right, start with resolve. In terms of resolve, I don't think there's any meaningful difference. Obviously, the Ukrainians are resolved to win this one and to get back their territory. Completely understandable. And obviously, the Russians are resolved to win this one and settle this conflict as best they can on favorable terms. And given that they think they see an existential threat facing them, their resolve is great. So I don't see any meaningful difference in the balance of resolve. What about the balance of population? Going into the war, the Ukrainians had far less people than the Russians. The balance was 3.5 to 1 going into the war. There were 3.5 Russians for every Ukrainian. Today, I believe there are 5 Russians for every 1 Ukrainian. You just want to think about that. 5 to 1 imbalance. You all understand that 8 million Ukrainians have left the country. 3 million have gone to Russia. And that 3.5 to 1 ratio that I gave you was based on the assumption that those Russian speakers and ethnic Russians in the Donbass counted as part of the Ukrainian population. They're now counted as part of the Russian population. I could go on and on about the numbers, but I think 5 to 1 is a good ratio to explain where we are at today. And this is bad news for the Ukrainians. Then we come to the artillery imbalance. Almost all of the reports on that balance say the number is either 5 to 1, 7 to 1, or maybe 10 to 1 in the Russians' favor. This has massive consequences. Massive consequences. You just want to think about what this war is all about. It's 2 armies standing toe-to-toe, trying to kill each other with massive amounts of firepower. And one side has a 5 to 1 or a 7 to 1 or a 10 to 1 advantage. The side that's on the lower end of that ratio is in the deep kimchi. This is really horrendous. And by the way, that country that's on the downside of that ratio in artillery also is on the downside in the population ratio. What do the casualties look like on both sides? Very hard to get numbers. If you press me, I could give you an estimate, but it would just be suggestive on what the actual numbers are. But let's just talk about what the casualty exchange ratio is likely to be. The Ukrainians often say, and it's reported frequently in the West, that 7 Russians die for every 1 Ukrainian. This is ludicrous. 7 Russians die for every 1 Ukrainian, given that artillery imbalance? This fails the common sense test. I think that the exchange ratio is more like 2 to 1. I think that 2 Ukrainians probably die for every 1 Russian. I have a number of friends who believe the number is higher. It's more like 3 to 1, maybe even 4 to 1. Again, just given those artillery figures, it's got to be 2 to 1 at least. So the Ukrainians are losing lots more people than the Russians are. Now, let me argue against myself, okay? One could say John's wrong, because what John is ignoring is that the Russians are on the offensive. As you all know, the Russians are the aggressor here. There's no question about that. It was Putin and company who invaded Ukraine. They are the aggressor. They are on the offensive. And as you know, offenders usually suffer 3 casualties for every 1 casualty that the defender suffers. This is the famous 3-to-1 rule of thumb. You need 3 attackers. You actually need more than 3 attackers, right, to overcome 1 defender on the battlefield, because the offender is out in the open and is exposed to fire, whereas the defender is down in a foxhole or down in a trench and is protected somewhat, okay? So the argument against me is that because the Russians are the aggressor or the offender, they should be suffering 3 casualties for every 1 that the Ukrainians suffer. There's 3 problems with this argument. The first is that the Ukrainians have been on the offense almost as much as the Russians have been. As I said to you before, 2022 was a very good year for the Ukrainians because they launched offensives in Kharkiv and Kherson. And they were launching other offensives of a smaller nature in other places. People were talking about the Ukrainians' ability to engage in maneuver warfare. Okay? So if you look at the course of the war since February 24th, 2022, it's very difficult to make the argument that the Russians have been on the offensive more than the Ukrainians have been on the offensive. It looks like a wash to me. Another problem with this is if you look at the actual battles, places like Bakhmut, sort of other places where the Russians and the Ukrainians have really duked it out, what you discover is that the defender often counterattacks. And what that means is that the defender goes on the offense. So I spent a lot of time way back when studying Civil War battles and studying World War I battles. If you look at those battles and you look at who is the attacker and who is the defender, in some cases, this is true of Verdun, the offender actually suffers less casualties than the defender, right? And that's because the defender goes on the offense for defensive purposes. And the offender becomes the defender. And then the offender goes back on the offense, right? So you have this back and forth. Look at Civil War battles. You look at the 12 biggest Civil War battles. The casualty exchange ratios, regardless of who initiated the campaign, are basically 1-to-1 in a good number of those cases. It's really quite interesting. So it's very hard to say that in the battles that have been fought in Ukraine that the Russians have been the attackers. And they therefore have suffered much greater casualties. Because even if they were initially the attackers, they morphed into defenders at different points, then went back to being offenders, and the same basic process was taking place on the Ukrainian side. And the end result is it's a wash. Third argument you want to keep in mind is that in the Western media, you see constant references to the Russians launching mindless frontal assaults or frontal attacks. Think of World War I, everybody getting up out of the trenches, charging across an open field and getting mowed down. And this is the picture that the media wants to give you of what the Ukrainians are facing when the Russians come at them. And of course, they're just mowing them down. And this is why there are 7 Russians dying for every 1 Ukrainian. This is a myth. It's just simply not true, right? This is not to say the Russians haven't launched a few frontal attacks here and there. But it's very clear from the news reports that the Russians have become much more sophisticated, and they're using their infantry in small packets to basically smoke out, figure out where Ukrainian forces are, and then pouring huge amounts of artillery on those forces. They're not engaging in frontal assaults. And amazingly, 10 minutes before I came down, I was looking at my iPhone, and the latest issue of The Economist came across. And this is one of the lead stories. Russia's tactics are improving, but Ukraine can still win. Russia's tactics are improving, but Ukraine can still win. See, what's happened here is that The Economist has got hold of a new report that's come out from the Royal United Services Institute in Britain, which I would suggest you all take a look at. It makes it very clear that the Russians are employing smart tactics. They're not employing frontal wave tactics. So the end result of this is that large numbers of Russians are not dying, right? There's no question Russians are dying, but they're not dying in anywhere near as large a number as the Ukrainians are. So I think 2 to 1 is a reasonable estimate, a casualty exchange ratio of 2 to 1. And I think when you marry that to the population size of Ukraine and the population size of Russia today, you can see what's going on in Ukraine. What exactly do I mean by that? It's quite clear that Ukraine is engaged, from their point of view, in a total war. They have mobilized their entire society. They have soldiers who are as old as all of us out there fighting. They have old dogs and young dogs, lots of untrained people. It's because they're desperate. It's because they're desperate. And they're also dragging people off the street, right? There are all sorts of stories about how they're out searching for young people who they can commandeer and put in the military. This is not the case with the Russians, right? In fact, lots of people, me included, wonder why the Russians haven't really mobilized their society in a larger way, right? And by the way, this big fight that just took place in Bakhmut, it's clear that the Ukrainians pushed large numbers of their best troops into Bakhmut to try and hold Bakhmut. It was not the Russian army, however, that was doing most of the fighting in Bakhmut. It was the Wagner group. There's this huge Russian army out there. Remember those 300,000 people they mobilized? And those people were mobilized on top of a foundation of soldiers that already were there. They have a lot of people. They have a lot of people in their military. But their mainline forces have not been fighting. The Ukrainian forces have been fighting the mainline forces. They tried like crazy to hang on to Bakhmut, and they couldn't do it, but it was with mainline forces. All right. All of this tells you why I think they're going to win. Now, let me conclude by talking about the possibility of peace agreement. Not going to be a peace agreement, meaningful peace agreement. Not going to happen. You'll get a frozen conflict. Why is there not going to be a meaningful peace agreement? Two main reasons. The first is the territory problem. The Ukrainians want their territory back. The Russians have made it clear they're not going to get their territory back. The Russians are not going to give up those 4 oblasts they annexed. They're not going to give up Crimea. And the Ukrainians insist on getting that back. Zelensky told Xi exactly this. There'll be no peace agreement until we get all our territory back. And the Russians are going to end up taking more territory. And they're not going to give that back either. How do you square that circle? Second big problem is the neutrality problem. The Russians insist that Ukraine be neutral. Right? They've insisted this from the beginning, and their argument is if Ukraine can't be neutral, they're going to wreck it. They're going to wreck it to keep it out of NATO, or if it's in NATO, it'll be ineffective because it's wrecked. Right? The Ukrainians, on the other hand, They don't want neutrality. The Ukrainians, for completely understandable reasons, want a security guarantee from someone. Well, the question of who is that someone? The only someone out there is the United States or the West or NATO. And that's not going to happen, right? That's not going to happen in ways that will please the Russians. The Russians will not accept that. So how do you square that circle, right? You don't. Two other quick problems here. One is the hyper-nationalism problem. There's a lot of nationalism in the air before this war started. It's morphed into hyper-nationalism, which means the hatred on both sides is off the charts. It's going to make a peace agreement very difficult. And then the other problem is that a number of leaders have made it clear that they lied to Putin about their commitment to the Minsk agreement. You remember the Minsk agreement, which was formulated in late 2015, was designed to shut down the conflict in the Donbass, and Putin was deeply committed to making the Minsk agreement work because he did not want to invade Ukraine. Angela Merkel, Francois Hollande, Petro Poroshenko, and Zelensky himself have all said they never had any interest in making Minsk work, and all they were doing was buying time to build up Ukraine so it would be in a better position to fight Russia. Trust? There's no trust on the Russian side because of this. So you see, you have a problem involving territory, a problem involving neutrality, hyper-nationalism, and zero trust. You're not going to get a meaningful peace agreement. You're going to get a frozen conflict. Let me conclude by just very briefly saying that what's remarkable about this case is that there were a significant number of people in the United States who argued that expanding NATO was going to lead to disaster. It included people like George Kennan. It included people like the actual Secretary of Defense, Bill Perry, and the actual chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Clinton administration, saying this was a disaster in the making. It included people like Paul Nitze and Jack Matlock, of course. There were a panoply of impressive intellects who said that this was a prescription for disaster. And you know what? They were right. And the end result is we are in this situation where enormous damage has already been done to Ukraine, most importantly, but to the West, to Russia, and to the United States. And with the passage of time, I'm sad to say, it's only going to get worse. Thank you.
Thank you, John. It was great. We have a significant amount of people that could not be here physically who want to participate. Okay. I see Ray McGovern there.
Hello, Ray.
Hello, John. Two questions, really. The first one is just a small question, and that is, you don't get to Washington, D.C. very much. Have people in the State Department and the CIA and the Pentagon be after you to consult with you, given your expertise on this, or have you not heard anything from them this time?
I am 75 years old. I have been in this business for a long time. I have never once in my entire career been asked by a government official, Republican or Democrat, for my opinion on anything.
Okay. Okay, second question. There's the conventional wisdom that Vladimir Putin had other options to invading Ukraine. This is sort of accepted widely by virtually everyone. No one can tell me what those options are. Do you know what they might be talking about, John? End of question.
No, I don't think he had any other options. I do believe that Putin was deeply committed to finding a negotiated settlement to the problem. As I said to you in my formal comments, he was deeply committed to the Minsk agreement because what he wanted to do was shut down the conflict in the Donbass so he would not have to invade. And with regard to NATO expansion, EU expansion, and the efforts to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's borders, he went to great lengths to explain to the West why that was unacceptable. And on December 17th, 2022, he sent a letter to Putin. Putin sent a letter to Biden and to NATO saying that you have to do X, Y, and Z so we can find a solution to this problem. And we refused to go along. And I think that Putin was left in a position where he felt he had no choice. Because to answer your question, there was no other way to deal with the problem. So I think he, with great reluctance, invaded Ukraine.
Thank you. Yeah. But I wanted to first make the observation, you may recall in, I believe it was 1962, when then Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara returned from his first journey to Vietnam to assess the situation on the battlefield, and he responded, by every quantitative measure, we're winning. I don't know whether that shakes confidence in your analysis, but I like your observation. But the more important question is, you know that Cy Hirsch's reports have suggested strongly that President Biden was responsible for destroying Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. Would that be consistent with your evaluation of what the U.S. goals are in the Ukraine war?
Yes. I think that the United States has been long interested, even before the war started, in severing the close economic ties between Russia on one side and Europe on the other side, especially Germany. And we have loathed Nord Stream for a long time. And if I had to bet, I would bet that the United States destroyed Nord Stream. I mean, there's much speculation on that at the moment, but it's completely consistent with sort of what America's overall policy is towards Russia.
So we have a question about Finland and Sweden. Why did Sweden and Finland? Why did Finland and Sweden enter NATO, join NATO, if they didn't fear Russia? So if you could address NATO expansion.
I think that there's no question that the Finns and the Norwegians fear Russia. I mean, given the level of Russophobia in the West, and given all the talk since 2014, and certainly since February 2022 about the Russian threat, it would make perfect sense for lots of Finns to fear the Russians. Do I believe that they should have feared the Russians? No. They survived the Cold War perfectly well when the Soviet Union was a heck of a lot more of a formidable adversary than Russia is. And furthermore, as I've emphasized time after time, there is zero evidence that Putin ever said he was interested in conquering and absorbing Ukraine into a greater Russia, much less that he was interested in conquering any other countries. He just never said that. The idea that he was going to conquer Finland or take some Finnish territory or Swedish territory is not a serious argument to me. But my opinion is that serious arguments don't carry the day in the world that we now live in. And, you know, the Finns and the Swedes obviously thought there was a serious threat here. And what they think does matter, as I said before. And this was a good opportunity to sneak into NATO because the Russians were obviously in no position to do anything about it because they're pinned down in Ukraine. But I would just end by saying that anybody who thinks this is all for the good is thinking wrongly. This is not good. It's just going to give the Russians an increased sense of vulnerability, an increased sense that they're being surrounded, and it's going to scare the Russians, and it's going to make them take greater risks. I've spent my life studying great power politics, and one thing you never want to underestimate is when you corner a great power and you threaten a great power, excuse me, you do not want to underestimate the risk that it might be willing to take. And the Russians are in that category for sure. And by the way, we all know about the Arctic, and we know that there are 8 countries that are located in the Arctic. One is Russia. The other 7 now are all NATO countries. The other 7 are all NATO countries, and Russia's up there. And you know what's happening to the ice up in that neck of the woods, right? The ice is melting. And you know that has all sorts of consequences of an economic and strategic nature. So there's going to be security competition up there. You think it's good that the Finns and the Swedes are with those other NATO countries against Russia? I don't think so. I think it's just more evidence of the trouble that lies ahead.
So, John, good question here. Could the Biden administration have prevented the Ukrainian war?
The Biden administration could have prevented the war by working out a deal with the Russians that would have satisfied Russia's security concerns. We're simply unwilling to do that. Very important to understand that Joe Biden handled the Ukraine portfolio during the Obama administration. When he was vice president, he handled the Ukraine portfolio, and he was a super hawk on Ukraine. And when he came into the White House in January 2021, shortly thereafter, that's when the trouble started. Because what Biden did was he doubled down, right? And Zelensky, who was initially elected to work out a peace deal with the Russians and to shut down the conflict in the Donbass, Zelensky did a flip at the same time that Biden moved into the White House. Zelensky became deeply anti-Russian in early 2021, and he became deeply committed, which he hadn't been in the past, to bringing Ukraine into NATO. So Biden and Zelensky together, right, upped the ante. And what did the Russians do? You remember in April 2021, that's when the Russians mobilized their army and put large forces on Ukraine's border. It's no accident that that happened in April 2021, given that Joe Biden moved into the White House in January 2021. And then in December 2021, December 17th, that's when Putin sent the letter to Biden and sent the letter to Stoltenberg, right? And then in January 2022, Tony Blinken made it very clear in response to the December 17th letter that the United States was not going to change its policy one iota.
So, John, here's a question about U.S. support. How much is this an American war? We're, what, 113 billion into this now, and running. We're running pretty much through that money. And the Europeans, are they in for about 10% of this?
Yeah, I think the Europeans are anteing up. It varies.
Where do you think they are? What number do you put on?
I don't know what the exact numbers are.
Is it 10, 20%?
Oh, I'd guess it's more like 20%.
20?
That would be my guess.
So the question then is if the West's support for Ukraine were to stop, would their peace demands, would that change your forecast on your pessimistic forecast on diplomacy?
Well, if the West stops arming Ukraine, Ukraine is doomed, right? There's just no question about that, right? I mean, the Russians have an indigenous armaments industry that's actually quite impressive. They have an armaments industry that's designed to fight World War I. And since this war looks like World War I, they're in quite good shape. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, do not have an industrial base that comes even close to being able to fight this kind of war. So they're heavily dependent on us. And by the way, we have trouble. We have trouble giving the Ukrainians what they need. They need artillery. We can't give them artillery fast enough. That's the problem. That's why we're giving them things like tanks and talking about F-16s. We don't have the artillery to give to them, okay? But the point is, John, they depend heavily, the Ukrainians depend heavily on the West for money, right, to keep their government running, and they depend heavily on us for weapons and will rely more and more on us for weapons moving forward. If we cut off the flow of weapons to Ukraine, the Russians would be in the driver's seat. There's just no question about that. But we're not going to do that. We're in this one too deep. You remember how long it took us to get out of Afghanistan? 20 years. 20 years to get out of Afghanistan. And a lot of us in this room were old enough to remember the Vietnam War. It tore the country apart, and it took us a long time to get out of that war, and it was only when Congress basically told the executive, this war's got to end, right? And we're a long way from that point in this country at this point in time. So I think we're in. I think the Europeans are in. Our support may diminish somewhat, but I don't think it's going to diminish much.
Okay. There are kind of two related questions. What Putin apparently has told Bush that Ukraine is not a real country. Is Putin really view? How do the Russians view Ukraine as a totally separate country or part of Russia? And there's that very big history. And then the question is related is, assuming you are correct, and Ukraine loses, and what comes next? And this is the question of whether they have ambitions outside of this war towards Poland or the other Eastern European countries. You hear that all the time by people that support the war.
Yeah, I'll take them in reverse order. What comes next? What comes next? If the Russians were to conquer 4 more oblasts and basically stop there, because that was all the territory they wanted, given the demographics, I think the Russians would then spend the next 25 to 30 years trying to absorb those 8 oblasts into Russia. You understand, when you see places like Bakhmut, you see the pictures of Bakhmut, how it's been totally destroyed. Well, that's going to be Russian territory, right? They're going to have to repair Bakhmut. There's going to be a huge amount, I didn't talk about this, of ethnic cleansing that takes place, or population transfers. Lots of ethnic Ukrainians are going to move west, and lots of Russian speakers and ethnic Russians are going to move westward. Both countries are going to have their hands full trying to absorb those people. Russia has economic problems. It had economic problems before this war started. It has economic problems that are a consequence of this war. The last thing the Russians are going to want to do is invade the Baltic states or invade Poland. One more point on this. If you look at the Soviet experience in Eastern Europe during the Cold War, trying to occupy and manage their so-called allies in Eastern Europe, it was actually something of a nightmare. In 53, they didn't have to invade East Germany because they were already there, but they had to put down an insurrection. They had to go into Hungary in 56. They had to go into Czechoslovakia in 68. They almost went into Poland 3 separate times, except the Polish communists put down the problem, right? Then they had to deal with the Albanians and the Romanians. Talk about something that could really give you a headache. The last thing the Russians want to do is conquer those territories which are filled with people who hate Russians, don't want to be part of Russia, and will put up great resistance. It makes no sense at all. And this is why Putin has never said he had any interest in creating a greater Russia or incorporating all of those Ukrainians into a greater Russia. It's the porcupine problem. It would have been like swallowing a porcupine. So my argument is that when all is said and done, what Putin is going to concentrate on, or his successors are going to concentrate on, is just absorbing the territory that they now have. Now, with regard to the first question, this gets to causes. I often say, as I said here tonight, there's no evidence that Putin was interested in conquering Ukraine. And the argument that people will turn to is they'll say, he told George W. Bush that Ukraine is not a real country, okay? And you want to say to yourself, is this a piece of evidence that he was bent on conquering Ukraine? First of all, if he said this, it's the only time he ever said it, right? It's the only time he ever said it. And number two, it's not clear that's what he said because he was telling George Bush, who was telling us. And I'm not accusing George Bush of being disingenuous, but who knows, right? But this is the one example. But let's assume he told Bush that, and Bush gave us an accurate representation of what Putin says. So what? He said it's not a real country. Did he say, I want to conquer that country? Did he say, I think it's feasible to conquer that country? Did he say that I can do it? That's what I'm going to do, right? No, there's no evidence of that. And of course, what's the key document they point to? You know, when I make that offer, that response to that quote, everybody goes to the July 12th, 2021 article that Putin wrote, right? That's supposed to be the smoking gun that he was going to conquer Ukraine. This is not a serious argument. Right? He says exactly the opposite. It's very clear from the piece, the July 12th, 2021 piece, that he recognizes Ukrainian nationalism. He recognizes it. It's very clear that he recognizes that Ukraine is an independent country. And he recognizes that the events of December 1991 are locked in stone, that there's no way, right, you can go back to the Soviet Union. And he ends his article by saying that what Ukraine becomes is what the Ukrainian people will decide it will become. So there is no evidence other than this one quote, which I don't think is real evidence, that he was bent on conquering Ukraine. And by the way, if anybody thinks I'm wrong, I wish you would send me an email with the evidence that shows I'm wrong. I engage on the internet all the time with people who write me, who say that he had designs on conquering all of Ukraine and absorbing it into a greater Russia. I tell them to send me the evidence. And I say, I want hard evidence, right? And none.
So another question is, what will be the impact of these F-16s being sent to Ukraine? You talked about the artillery ratios, but where do the F-16s come in the military balance?
I don't think the F-16s will matter very much at all for a variety of reasons. First of all, it takes a lot of time to train pilots to fly an F-16. You just don't produce combat pilots overnight. You know, if you go back to the Battle of Midway in World War I, June 1942, about 6 months after Pearl Harbor, You remember we sunk 4 Japanese carriers at Midway, and this was seen as a mortal blow to the Japanese Navy. Actually, it wasn't the carriers that mattered that much. It was all the pilots that we killed. It just takes, my brother was a Navy pilot, and he used to talk about this all the time. It just takes a long period of time to train first-rate pilots. And so they're not going to have first-rate pilots for a while. They're talking about, training them up in 4 months and then putting them in the cockpit and sending them into combat. That's not going to work very well. Second point is the Russians, by all accounts, have the best ground-based air defenses in the world with their S-400s, S-300s, and all these other systems. Those F-16s are going to be in real trouble going up against the ground-based air defenses. The other thing is that the Russians have a formidable air force of their own that has lots of combat experience, is gaining combat experience, and will be ready to engage those F-16s. I think the real danger with the F-16s is that Ukrainians use them to attack targets in Russia. Right? This is the escalation scenario, right? And we apparently, President Biden apparently has told the Ukrainians in no uncertain terms that they cannot use the F-16s to attack targets inside of Ukraine. And inside of Russia, thank you. Yeah, inside of Russia. And apparently they have promised, but I wouldn't bank on them delivering on that promise, because you all know that the Ukrainians have a vested interest in dragging us into the war, right? You understand that. If you're playing Ukraine's hand, you want to suck the Americans in to come to your defense. And Biden, of course, is fully aware of that, as are his advisors, and they're trying to protect against it. But it's a very tricky issue because we can't cut and run. What are we going to do if the Ukrainians start using their F-16s to attack the Kremlin or attack targets in Russia? Are we going to say, all right, we quit, you're on your own now? Of course we're not. We're going to holler at them, tell them don't do it again. But slowly but steadily, we're going to be pulled in because at some point the Russians are going to retaliate. By the way, one point that I didn't make to you folks, that's a very important point to keep in mind. I said that I think the Russians are going to win on the battlefield. They will end up winning this war. If I'm wrong and the Russians lose and that the Biden administration begins to move in a direction where its goals are being achieved in Ukraine, I think the likelihood of nuclear use is high. I think the Russians are likely, maybe even very likely, to turn to nuclear weapons if they're losing. So the fact that the Russians are likely to win this war, in my opinion, makes the possibility of nuclear war much less likely.
So we got a couple of questions about Russia being incorporated, Russia being incorporated into Europe. What the Russian Federation membership in NATO, what went wrong, and then a related question, some Eurasian Union that would include the Russian Federation plus the former Warsaw USSR countries and the European Union. Is that in the U.S. interest or not? Or you take those.
Yeah, I think that it would have been in the U.S. interest to work out some sort of security arrangement with the Russians starting in January of 1992. Remember, Russia, Soviet Union falls apart in December 1991. The next month, January 1992. I think we had a deep-seated interest in having good relations with the Russians. My theory of great power politics tells me that if you're dealing with a really powerful Russia that's a peer competitor to us, the way China is a peer competitor to us in East Asia, you're going to have significant problems with Russia, right? just like you had significant problems with the Soviet Union. In May of 1945, when Germany was finally defeated, you had this huge Russian army in the middle of Europe. Germany was destroyed. France had been knocked out of the war and was badly weakened. Britain was badly weakened by the war. We were greatly fearful that the Soviet Union would march all the way to the Atlantic just because it had such a powerful military. The Russians today are not the Soviet Union. They just aren't. So, and they certainly were not the Soviet Union in the 1990s. You all remember what a basket case Russia was in the 1990s. What we should have done was gone to great lengths to work out some sort of modus vivendi in Europe. And again, this is what people like Kennan, Bill Perry, General Saakashvili, all these people understood, that, you know, poking the Russians in the eye with a stick, which is what we did with NATO expansion, was going to be counterproductive in the end, as it's turned out to be the case. And what we should have done was try to work out some sort of security arrangement, which I actually think could have been done, because again, the Russians were not likely to go on the prowl. Yeah, just on the whole subject of Russia joining NATO, I think that it was never possible because Russia's too big and too powerful, right? The United States likes NATO because it runs the show. It's very important to understand that. It's like, you know, President Obama and President Trump both complained bitterly about the fact that the Europeans don't pull their weight. They don't spend enough money on defense. I actually think we don't care that much. And the reason we don't care that much is because it gives us leverage over them. They're dependent on us, right? The Europeans depend on us, and we like that. And we use NATO for our own selfish purposes. If you put the Russians inside of NATO, not so much in the 90s, but certainly after 2000, as, you know, Putin brings them back from the dead, right? It becomes very difficult to envision the United States having the kind of leverage inside the alliance that it otherwise has. So I think that was a non-starter. With regard to the Budapest Memorandum, which was issued in conjunction with Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons, it's very important for me to emphasize to you that I was the only person in the West who argued that Ukraine should not give up its nuclear weapons, because I said there is a good chance that someday the Russians will come knocking, and Ukraine, for deterrence purposes, will need those weapons. But we gave the Ukrainians compound fractures of all 4 limbs to make sure they gave up the nuclear weapons. And in fact, they gave them back to Russia. And in return, we gave them the Budapest Memorandum, which, as everybody understood, was an empty promise to defend them. It was a meaningless piece of paper. And the reason is we did not, at that point in time, want to commit ourselves with a NATO-like guarantee, an Article 5-like guarantee, to have to defend Ukraine. So the Budapest Memo, you know, last year in February, when the Russians invade Ukraine, is basically meaningless. And as you know, the Russians signed the Budapest Memorandum as well as we did. So it really didn't mean anything. The smart thing for Ukraine to have done would have been to keep its nuclear weapons. But that simply wasn't going to happen because Uncle Sam was not going to let it happen. The Russians were not going to let it happen. And therefore, Ukraine was left defenseless. And this gets back to an earlier point, or an earlier question that John raised. In the end, Ukraine can't defend itself, right? That's why he was saying if we cut off the flow of weapons to Ukraine, wouldn't Ukraine just lose? And John, of course, is right. Ukraine can't protect itself at the conventional level. That's why nuclear weapons made sense. But again, that was a non-starter. I was a voice in the wilderness.
Kind of as an add-on to the questions that were just asked about NATO, Russia joining NATO, I wonder if Dr. Mearsheimer could comment on why perhaps the Partnership for Peace program and also the permanent committee that developed out of the NATO-Russia Founding Act, why those didn't function in a way that might have stabilized the situation better. That's number one. Number two, just as kind of a totally separate issue and a little bit theoretical to start with, Dr. Mearsheimer, you've mentioned in the past in other presentations I've heard of yours that you don't view realism as a comprehensive explanation for how international relations or foreign policy actually works or develops. You view it as a model. It's a simplified model that has good predictive power. And I think you've tossed out the figure that maybe in about 80% of the time it predicts the outcome well, and 20% it doesn't. I'm wondering if there's anything discernible or identifiable that might be responsible for the 20% of cases where realism doesn't predict, and if some way that can be leveraged to come up with creative solutions that would kind of let one break out of this trap that we seem to be in, that is, I think, to some extent at least predicted by realism right now. Thank you.
Okay, just very quickly on Ben's question about the PFP. The PFP was a non-starter because the desire of the East European countries to get into NATO was great, and the interests of the administration to expand NATO, this vibrant institution that we had created in the West, and move it eastward, and move the EU eastward, these two great institutions that were left over from the Cold War, and expand them, and expand the zone of peace, right? This is what motivated NATO expansion up to 2008. Remember, I told you before 2008, nobody was talking about containing Russia. They were talking about creating a zone of peace that included not just Western Europe, as was the case during the Cold War, but included Eastern Europe as well. It was one giant zone of peace, right? And the PFP was not good enough. It was kind of a half-baked security arrangement. We wanted a real security arrangement. We wanted a vibrant institution. At least the Clinton administration did, which was in charge when the ball got rolling. And that's why PFP never went anywhere. But I want to be clear, there were lots of people who liked PFP. I would have taken PFP over NATO expansion in a moment, but that was not the prevailing wisdom inside the Clinton administration. With regard to realism, I don't want to get into this in any great detail. I'm a realist, as you know. I do IR theory. Theory is a simplification of reality, right? There's this world out there that's incredibly complicated, and the only way we can make sense of it is with simple theories. And when you have a simple theory that describes a complicated world, that means you leave certain factors on the cutting room floor to produce your simple theory. And that means your theory is sometimes going to be proved wrong. Does everybody understand that? Theories are simplifications of a complicated reality, and a simple theory leaves certain factors on the floor. My realist theory leaves domestic politics on the cutting room floor. My theory does not distinguish between democracies and authoritarian states. All states are black boxes in my theory. Now, obviously, that's not the case. Sometimes domestic politics matters, and when it matters, my theory is wrong. Now, this is why I said to you up front, I am not dispensing truth here. I may be wrong, right? This is why. You know, just a quick story. As John knows, much to his chagrin, I argued from the early 2000s forward that China could not rise peacefully. Okay, I argued starting in 2001 in print that we would be in the mess that we're in now today. But whenever I talked about it including in China, I would always say to people, this is based on my theory of how the world works. My theory is far from perfect. And I estimate that my theory is right 75% of the time and wrong 25% of the time. Because I loved going to China and I love dealing with the Chinese, I used to say, I hope I'm wrong. I really do. I hope I'm wrong, that China can rise peacefully. But my theory says that's not true. But again, theories are not perfect. So with regard to the discussion tonight, I may be wrong, okay? And it may be the case in 2 years, you'll invite me back, I'll have egg all over my face, and we'll discuss why I was wrong. But all I will say is I actually can't see why I'm going to be wrong. There are cases, I deal with from time to time where, I'm not too sure that I'm going to be proved right. And in fact, China is one of them. I was not 100% certain. But on this one, I think we committed a colossal blunder. And I just find it hard to see how we figure out how to get out of this mess. It just looks like it goes on and on for as far as the eye can see.
You were saying earlier that you thought it was a worse mistake than us invading Iraq.
Oh, yeah, much worse mistake than invading Iraq. I mean, I have a whole section. I wrote the speech out, and I have a whole section on the consequences, right? And when you start thinking about the consequences just for European-Russian relations moving forward, talk about Nord Stream and what are the consequences of that. The Russians are going to be interfering in European politics. They're going to be looking for cleavages in European politics and trying to exploit them. The Russians are going to be looking for cleavages in the transatlantic relationship and trying to exploit those cleavages. We are going to be going to great lengths to undermine Russia economically and politically. They're going to be trying to wreck Ukraine. We're going to be trying to save Ukraine. Where does this end? As I said before, I think we'll all be dead, and it'll still be going on.
The Chinese are not going to be the solution to peace.
No.
Okay.
Can I just say a word about that?
That was a question.
I was on Indian TV not too long ago, and the Indian commentator was saying to me, is there a role here for India? And, he thought India could do something because India is quite friendly with the Russians and with the Americans, And now you hear the Chinese being trumpeted as a possible deus ex machina, right? But the problem is there's no deal, right? Whether it's the Chinese, the Indians, or somebody comes in from outer space, or they put John Henry on it. What's the deal you're going to work out? How are you going to solve the territorial problem? How are you going to solve the issue of neutrality? Unless you're a magician, I just don't think it's doable. I mean, I hope I'm wrong, but.
John, this was terrific. We're way over our time, but we still have a whole bunch of questions. So please don't hesitate to come up and ask them to John. But thank you again. It's a voice that needs to be heard.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Great job.